This is Katrin with Disability Rights New York. Welcome to our podcast, Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned. We are here to bring you information on the most relevant topics regarding disability rights and advocacy. Today, we welcome DRNY's PAAT, PATBI, and PAVA Director, Christy Asbee, and she's here to discuss the $2.2 million fund available from the Department of Justice settlement with Amtrak, the National Railroad Passenger Corporation. Christy, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Christy, on December 2nd, 2020, the Department of Justice and Amtrak entered into an agreement to resolve the department's findings of discrimination towards people with disabilities, and that was in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. Let's talk about some of the accessibility issues that the DOJ found at Amtrak stations.
Stations and trains across the country were reported to the DOJ as being inaccessible. And as a result, the DOJ started an investigation, and they, as you said, came up with a really comprehensive agreement that is applicable nationwide to improve access for people with mobility disabilities, both in the rail stations themselves and into the rail cars. We're focusing here, the affected individuals have mobility disabilities, where these individuals are using wheelchairs, walkers, canes, and other AT or assistive technology to get around the stations and into the rail cars. So the station, even at the entry level or the sidewalk outside of the station could be inaccessible because, for example, it doesn't have a curb cut, or it has cracked pavement, or there is a lip that is over a quarter inch that is not ramped or beveled in any way. These are significant barriers for people with mobility disabilities, depending on what type of assistive technology you're using. These were identified as issues. Also, bathrooms were found to be inaccessible. Train platforms were found to be inaccessible. There were, at some stations, there was no way to get from the platform into the actual car itself. So these are all significant problems that people with mobility disabilities either tried to navigate but couldn't, or they did, they tried their best and were injured, or they just, quite frankly, avoided Amtrak altogether because they couldn't even get onto a train, or anticipating that they wouldn't be able to get off at the next train station or what have you.
It sounds like the DOJ did a pretty good job in really trying to address any and all issues that riders with mobility disabilities may have experienced at Amtrak. Let's talk about the agreement itself. What does this agreement offer riders with disabilities that may have experienced some of these issues?
There were a lot of terms in this agreement that were very responsive to ensuring that people who have mobility disabilities would be able to use Amtrak. I think that the most talked about term in this agreement is the fund to pay out people who have mobility disabilities who were affected by the inaccessible train, either stations or getting into the train itself. That is a $2.25 million fund that, or I guess I should say it's a fund that could be funded up to $2.25 million, depending on the claims that are received. Other important terms in this agreement are that Amtrak is going to be responsible for either modifying existing stations or constructing new stations over the next 10 years to ensure that they comply with ADA minimum guidelines. So they have properly sloped ramps, and they do not have step where the entrance wouldn't be accessible. They have curb cuts. The platforms are accessible for wheelchairs and people who use walkers and et cetera. A whole host of guidelines that need to be followed. Also included in this agreement is a requirement for Amtrak to train their staff with ADA compliance training to make sure that the staff are doing what they need to do to accommodate riders who have mobility disabilities. There is also a streamlined customer complaint system that was created out of this agreement. and that will be managed and monitored by the Department of Justice. So for riders who still experience accessibility barriers at stations can use this. And this complaint system is not limited in scope, which we'll talk about the scope of this agreement and what stations apply in just a second. Also, what I found very interesting about this agreement is there is a provision in this agreement that gives the Department of Justice the ability to pursue monetary claims against Amtrak if Amtrak fails to comply with the agreement. I thought that was quite interesting and impactful, because if somebody does have a serious issue that's not being addressed during the term of this agreement, DOJ did carve out the ability to pursue additional monetary relief for people beyond just potentially $2.25 million fund.
So it sounds like the DOJ is really trying to ensure that anyone who may have claims that either possibly go unanswered or have issues, that there's a possible secondary remedy if necessary. And I suppose our audience members should be aware that as far as the stations and modifications that need to be made, Amtrak has 10 years. So this is not going to be necessarily an overnight or a quick fix to the physical issues at the train stations or the trains and access to bathrooms on themselves. So this is going to take some time. And as people are learning more about this, where can they access the full list of the 78 stations that are included in this settlement?
The Department of Justice has a list of all the stations that first will be part of the 10-year remediation plan. That is a different list from the list of stations that would make an individual who has a mobility disability that experienced an issue or was harmed at an inaccessible Amtrak station. The list that would make you eligible for that compensation fund. And I think that that's what's most relevant right now is the list of stations that are subject to this compensation fund. For New York State in particular, there are only 3 stations. The stations are Hudson, New York, Port Henry, New York, and Plattsburgh. Those are the only 3 stations where if you experienced as a rider or a potential rider an issue with accessibility because of your disability, that you could file a claim for part of this compensation fund.
And that brings us to our next question. When talking about who is eligible to submit a claim for monetary compensation, let's talk about who those people are and how they go about doing it. This isn't, if you use these stations, then you're able to submit a claim. There's certain criteria that needs to be met in order for someone to submit a claim. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, there's a claim process that every claimant needs to use to file a claim. If you don't follow the process, your claim may be denied or not even properly submitted and reviewed. So some of the key elements to filing a claim that you have to meet are that you have to have a mobility disability, and you have to have experienced some sort of harm, whether physically or emotionally, because you could not access the station. For example, if you use a wheelchair and you needed to use the bathroom in the waiting area while you were waiting to use your train at the Hudson train station, but you could not get into the bathroom because it was not accessible because the doorway is not wide enough. This is all hypothetical, by the way. I don't actually know how wide the Hudson doorway is to the bathroom. But if you were harmed because you could not get into the bathroom to use the bathroom, you could argue that that is harm because you were not able to access that facility. So if that happened to you from between the dates of July 27th, 2013 and December 2nd of 2020, then that would be considered this harm element. Another element that you have to satisfy in your claim is that you have to have been needing to use the station that you went to, so that there wouldn't have been another closer alternative station available that would have been accessible. So, for example, let's just stick with the Hudson station. If you perhaps were coming from a location, let's say Kinderhook, that's kind of close to Hudson, but it's also in between Albany and Hudson. If you were in Kinderhook and you chose to use the Hudson station as opposed to the Albany station, but you knew that the Albany station had more accessibility features that would allow you to avoid having the same harm that you experienced in Hudson, that may limit your ability to get the claim because there was an alternative station that was perhaps closer or equal distant to you that you could have used. So that's a part of the narrative of the claim that you make. And then the last main element that you have to satisfy is just you have to submit it properly. And that's all on the Department of Justice's website. And we will put that in the description of the podcast so you can have easy access to that.
So, Christy, there are a lot of elements that our audience members will need to satisfy to put their claims together. And there's a deadline. Let's talk about the deadline, and let's talk about if people have or need resources or assistance to help with these claims and to really understand if they satisfy the elements that are needed for these claims or any other implications that may come along with it. So let's talk about the deadline and what is available to our audience members should they need help.
It's a quickly approaching deadline. So all claims need to be fully submitted, where you fully complete the form and you narrate your issue so that you meet all these elements by May 29th of this year. So May 29th, 2021, that is the date that you have to properly submit your claim to be a part of the potential $2.25 million claim pool of money. If you have questions that you can ask of Amtrak, then Amtrak has a team that I actually don't know the availability, but they do have a lot of contact information to get to this team that is charged with helping people navigate the claims process. And that would be my first phone call if I were having questions about how to fill out this claim. This claim is available in different forms, and it's believed to be accessible for people. But if you need a different accommodation to complete this form, that is also a reason to contact Amtrak. You can submit your information by telephone, by email, by fax, and I think that there's an open online form as well. So there are lots of different options, and if you do have a question, we will be posting Amtrak contact information in our description as well.
And Christy, do people need an attorney to file this? Oftentimes when we hear about lawsuits or settlements, if someone is looking to make a claim, do they need to have an attorney for themselves or any type of representation?
That's a great question. And if you have experienced an injury at one of the 78 stations that is part of the claim fund, and again, in New York, that is Hudson, Port Henry, and Plattsburgh. Those are the only stations that are subject to that claims process. So if you have experienced an injury and it is significant enough where you feel that filing a claim is not going to satisfy the damages that were caused, then that is probably a situation where you would want to contact an attorney because filing the claim may have implications to you. Disability Rights New York, we are available. We serve people who are in New York who have disabilities. So for New Yorkers with mobility disabilities that have experienced an injury or some sort of harm at the Hudson station, the Port Henry station, or the Plattsburgh station, we can receive your calls and walk you through that process as well.
And as you said, Christy, the deadline is fast approaching. We're talking about May of 2021. We will at DRNY continue to set reminders and put them out on social media. And before we sign off, is there anything else that you'd like our audience to know about this settlement or transportation accessibility in general?
I want to stress that this settlement does not resolve all problems that exist at Amtrak stations. The settlement term is short, it's 3 years, but the project timeline is 10 years. So the oversight of this effort is a lot of it ends at the 3-year mark, and then it'll continue on for the duration of the 10-year improvement plan. But if you are experiencing issues, even if it's a temporary barrier that is preventing you from having access into an Amtrak station, there are ways that you can address this issue. And the Amtrak website has a complaint process that you can follow, which was part of the settlement agreement. And you can make a complaint of inaccessibility for the duration of this settlement. And it's not futile because the DOJ will review these complaints to see Amtrak's progress and response time.
Christy, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. I hope everybody's safe out there.
Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned has been brought to you by Disability Rights New York, your source for disability rights and advocacy. If you enjoyed our program, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this post. If there is a subject you would like us to discuss, please email podcast@drny.org or comment below. Tune in next Wednesday, where we'll bring you more information on disability rights in the state of New York. The closed captioned and ASL version of this podcast is available on our YouTube channel. To listen to more Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned, follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.